Honestly, I think the big thing with that is when we start out events, the first thing that we say is we're not here for you to necessarily compromise. If you find common ground, great. But if you walk away from this discussion and the only thing that you have gained out of it is this discussion, that is also a win.
Welcome back, amazing people, to another episode of The Hopeful Majority. I am so excited for the conversation today because we've got two fascinating BridgeUSA student leaders. And if you don't know what BridgeUSA is yet, it's the largest student organization in the country, bridging divides. And today we've got two leaders from two different sides of the political spectrum working at the University of Wyoming, which I'm told the word on the street is that it's a purple campus. So it's pretty split down the middle. And I think it'd be fascinating to hear what their perspectives are and what it's like to be a college student on the left and the right at the University of Wyoming. And I think it's a breath of fresh air because a lot of people, as you have started tuning into the show, want to get an insight of how we should actually approach these conversations and not just talk about them, but actually show it. And I thought it would be really cool to have that discussion. The other piece I'll just say is that one of the biggest critiques this work gets is, Manu, where are all the conservatives? Manu, where are all the liberals? Depending on where you are on the political spectrum, people are always curious. And I felt, well, what better than to actually have a conservative-leaning student and a liberal-leaning student share their views? And so today we have on Hayden and Ashlyn from the University of Wyoming chapter. I think it's a fascinating conversation, and we're going to get right into it. Remember, YouTube, Spotify, Apple, wherever you get your content, leave a like, subscribe. We got to build this hopeful majority together, people. And if you're on YouTube, the background's different because I just moved and we're still figuring this thing out, but the eagle still stands. And if you're on Spotify and Apple and you're like, what eagle is he talking about? Hop over to YouTube. All right, my friends, let's actually hear from Hayden and Ashlyn directly. So Hayden, welcome to the show. Tell me a little bit about where you stand politically.
Yeah, so I would describe myself as a left-leaning centrist. I grew up in one of the most conservative counties in America, but my family is a family of staunch Democrats. So I have had quite a mixture of different beliefs through my life.
And it's fascinating. We're going to dive into this a little bit, that you grew up in one of the most conservative red-leaning counties in the country as a Democratic family. I'd love to hear what that experience is like. But before that, let me invite on Ashlyn onto the show. Ashlyn, it's great to meet you. Tell us where you stand politically.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. I would definitely consider myself right-leaning or conservative, even though I grew up in Colorado, which has been a blue state for a long time. Moving up to Wyoming and kind of exploring different cultures and whatnot has definitely helped me step into my beliefs and understand what I think better. And hopefully I can relay that to you guys best today.
And I'm just curious, was your family more conservative leaning, more liberal, politically apathetic? Like, how would you define your family?
My family is definitely more conservative, both
Okay.
of my parents, and I would say my sibling too.
So that's so interesting. So you both come from conservative and liberal households in the opposite political sort of geography. So you both are like standout members of the community. So I have to ask you, Ashlyn, what was it like to be conservative in such a blue?
That's a really good question. And honestly, I don't think I really kind of understood where I kind of stood on the political spectrum until I got to Wyoming, which is kind of funny. But in Colorado, I would say I'm from a suburb of Denver. So Denver is obviously a very left-leaning place. But I would say, surprisingly, the suburbs that surround it, I would say, are more red, which is surprising. So I don't necessarily think I had any like weird experiences or interesting one-off type of situations where my political beliefs were maybe compromised or challenged by the people around me because of where I grew up. With that being said, I think had I been closer to Denver, even only being a half hour away, I think had I been in the city of Denver, I would have had a much different story.
Hayden, what was it like, just if I ask the same question, being a Democrat or a liberal leaning, left-leaning centrist in the most conservative county in the country? Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, there definitely, I kind of felt like there wasn't a lot of like representation of my own political beliefs growing up. Like there weren't a lot of allies around, And so I think from a very early age, I learned how to kind of have that discussion with people who did fundamentally disagree with me on a lot of different things, in a way that was still productive for both people. At the time I was 6, 7, 8 years old. I'm not going toe to toe with an adult in a proper debate. So I kind of had to learn how to have those discussions in a peaceful way that we could actually both gain something out of that.
Tell me one thing, and either of you could take this question. Like, I still don't, frankly, know where I stand on the political spectrum. I feel like, especially doing Bridge, a lot of the work has been, frankly, trying to understand what is exactly happening in the world because it's moving at such a fast pace. And a lot of my work is spent, again, empowering young people like yourselves to actually have these conversations. So how did you develop like a sense of ideological standing at such a young age? Like it's pretty rare for that to happen. And I know that for a fact you weren't just like born a Republican or a Democrat. So either of you could take this. Like, I'm just curious how you had your ideological formation.
Yeah, I mean, I guess for me, a lot of it was kind of process of elimination. I'd come across an idea and I'd be like, "Oh, I don't think I like that one actually," and then I kind of move on to the next idea, and eventually kind of found one that I liked, and then with that, kind of grew on more and more with that idea in different directions. But yeah, I think a lot of it was actually just running into things that I disagreed with, and that kind of helped shape what I did believe in.
That's fascinating. What about you, Ashlyn?
I would say, like I mentioned earlier, coming to college was absolutely the turning point for me in kind of understanding where I stand. Even though we are like the only four-year university in the state of Wyoming, and Wyoming has been red for ages, we do have a very large liberal population on campus here. And so that kind of gave me the opportunity to be surrounded by people that I didn't necessarily agree with, or we couldn't come to eye to eye on some things. But I was also at the same time surrounded by people that I do agree with, and that I could see eye to eye with people on that sometimes. So I think it was just kind of like Hayden said, process of elimination, hearing conversations other people had in a college setting and kind of being like, okay, what do I think about that? What does that mean if I don't agree with that? What does that mean if I do agree with that?
And would you say that Wyoming, like, how would you describe the University of Wyoming's ideological composition?
I would say it's a really even split between conservatives and liberals. Probably a slightly more conservative.
Which is pretty rare.
It
Yes.
is, yeah. No, it's definitely not something you see a lot on college campuses, and our community as a whole is pretty heavily conservative leaning. Um, but yeah, I'd say our college is pretty evenly split, and I think the heavy presence of conservatives on campus really also helps to bring out some of the more niche communities within kind of the larger like conservatism umbrella. For example, we have a really staunch libertarian group who I really wouldn't classify as either conservative or liberal, but they have found this like place where they can really flourish as libertarians, and true libertarians.
The libertarians always hanging out in their little bubble, not
Right.
pissing anyone off. Um, no offense to any of the libertarians out there, but I just as a follow up, like why is Wyoming that way? Because it's pretty rare. Was it like an agenda by the university to have an even split? Is it just that students gravitate from different geographies? Why do you think Wyoming is that way?
I mean, I think with the conservatives as a whole, Wyoming is kind of the perfect breeding ground for different groups of conservatives to come out because it's basically only conservatives. Even within our own kind of state legislature, for example, I kind of joke there's three different political parties in there, because there's a heavy split between what I call the old school Republicans and now the MAGA Republicans.
Right.
And then, of course, the Democrats within the state legislature. And I think the University of Wyoming, of course, being a college campus, has a more heavy liberal tilt than most of the surrounding area. But with it being such a staunchly conservative area, it kind of balances out into this nice little, pretty even split.
That's fascinating. And Ashlyn, when you showed up to campus, were you nervous about being a conservative on a college campus? Because I asked that. I was a freshman in 2017, which is like I guess now technically the year when like the dinosaurs walked. I guess I'm really old. No, I don't feel that way. And uh, there was this wasn't that much of an issue. And in fact, the way that Bridge started was as a result of some of those conversations and conflict on campus. which then sparked a national question about conservatism, college campuses, and ideological echo chambers. So what was it like for you showing up to campus, and what was that experience like?
Absolutely. I think I definitely was a little bit nervous just because, cancel culture is such a big thing nowadays. You have all these things that truthfully just intimidated me. Having other people hear my beliefs that wouldn't agree with me. I would consider myself somebody who's pretty shy and not necessarily very outspoken about what I believe unless I'm in a setting like this or a setting at a bridge event or something like that. So coming to college, I knew I would be challenged and I knew I would be surrounded by people who didn't agree with me. However, I don't think that that being inevitable necessarily eased any of my nerves. It kind of excited me at the same time. But yeah, it was also just coming at the same time with trying to figure out how to be in college and how to be away from my parents and all that. So I also don't know that I necessarily had a ton of time to really sit there and think about it until well into my freshman year.
And did you find there being a culture, and this is not specific to Wyoming, I'm just generally curious, did you find that there was a culture of fear on campus about saying what's on your mind? Or does it seem like because it's a relatively 50-50 split and there's relatively equal representation that there isn't that sort of culture of fear?
Honestly, here I will say there's not really a culture of fear. Maybe you would think that before you came here, but I do think that the more I've spent time at this campus, the more I've spent time with people here at this campus, you are going to find somebody on campus who agrees with you. You're going to find someone on campus who disagrees with you. So you might as well just talk about it, right? There's no, I feel like it's a risk I'm willing to take. And it's like Hayden said, with the even split, it's not like you're going to be judged and shunned and isolated and not be able to set foot out of your dorm. So I really do appreciate the balance that Wyoming offers.
You said you might as well just talk about it, which sounds like a very like easy sentiment, and yet that sounds very profound in this moment. Um, why do you think it is easy to talk about it being politics, your views? Do you think there's a certain sense of like social permission on campus, or just like why is that?
That's a really good question. I don't know that I've ever sat down to think about it. But it, again, goes back to what I said, knowing that someone out there will agree with you and you may not encounter them in a conversation you're having. But to me, I personally believe bad things happen when people stop talking to each other and kind of isolate themselves into this area where, we get into political echo chambers and we're just surrounding ourselves with people who believe the same thing as us. I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing, but I think in moderation it's a great thing. But I think that we need people who disagree with us around us. So with that being said, I definitely think that we should just, start talking about things like that. It's not, I think we need to take advantage of the fact that we're in Wyoming and that our campus is so diverse ideologically. And that's something that, of course, I've had to sit with for a little bit, because if you would have asked me the same question a year ago, I probably would have just kept to myself and called it a day, knowing that I believe what I believe. And at the end of the day, I can go to bed knowing that. So yeah, it's definitely a complicated question, I think.
So Hayden, one of the things that people oftentimes ask us is, does joining Bridge cause you to blunt your ideological convictions? And what they really mean by that is, if you're participating in these conversations, like Ashlyn was saying, if you're just talking about stuff, are you just sort of being a milquetoast liberal? Are you just sort of being a milquetoast conservative, right? What has been your experience at Bridge, but beyond Bridge as well? What is it like to balance having these conversations while also understanding that you yourself have like real beliefs and convictions?
Yeah. To kind of answer it straight up, I don't think it blunts your convictions at all. When we're doing our marketing, that is a big question that we get asked as well, is like, are you going to brainwash me the second I come into a Bridge discussion? And the answer is no. Like, we're here for you to have those discussions. But we're here for you to deliver your own belief. I'm not having you come out to a Bridge meeting with the intent of you changing your mind. I don't want you to change your mind. You have your beliefs. You have your reason for those beliefs. And in my experience, we have people come out. We have people that come out that are incredibly strong-willed and will believe what they believe till the day that they die. And I think that in and of itself is a very beautiful thing. They're very passionate about the things that they believe in. And when they come out, all I ask is that they have those conversations in a way that's peaceful. I don't even need it to necessarily be productive. I'm not asking you to come up with a policy solution. I'm just asking you to actually talk out, have your opinions, and be able to deliver those opinions in a way that makes sense to everybody and that isn't actively aggressive towards the other side.
So if the goal is not to change your mind, what do you think the goal is of a bridge conversation?
Honestly, I think the goal is just to have the conversation. I think there is a lot that can be or that can come out of having that conversation. My favorite example of this is we had a marijuana discussion. Marijuana is not legal in the state of Wyoming, but it's been something that's been thrown around the state legislature for the last 6 or 7 years now. And at our discussion, we had a group of very staunch anti-marijuana voters and a group of very much so pro-marijuana voters. And they really didn't agree
Wow.
on much except for the fact that they didn't like the smell of marijuana. And that was their one little thing that they really built on. And by the end of it, they were cracking jokes with each other. And that's the exact kind of thing that you want to see out of a bridge discussion. I don't necessarily want you to make a policy decision or sway your vote, but if you can crack a joke with the other side by the end of the discussion, I think it's been a successful discussion.
It would have been funnier if you said they just started smoking weed together, but that would have been a little too much. What do you think is when you say hey, it's just good to have the conversation, cracking a joke at the other side is a good thing. If you could go one layer deeper, why do you believe that is just a valuable thing? Why should someone spend their time doing that?
Yeah. Honestly, I think it's because there is a lot of common ground that kind of lays unseen until you have that discussion. So the president of Turning Point on our campus and the president for College Democrats, obviously politically staunchly opposed to each other, but they're weirdly great friends. They go out, they eat lunch together, and they both work in the student government or worked in the student government. And through their work in the student government, they were able to get a lot of things done together as a collaborative group. Despite the fact that they disagreed on a lot, they found that there was also quite a lot that they agreed on. For example, passenger rail in Wyoming is this thing that, we never really talk about. It's not a big hot topic political discussion, but it's something that they were able to find a lot of common ground on and eventually end up advocating at the state legislature for.
That's fascinating. Ashlyn, is there anything you want to add to that?
Just something super quick. I think another layer that kind of lies under that is the fact that cracking a joke and making things lighthearted almost shows us, it sounds cliche, but that we're all human and that we aren't necessarily needing to be defined by our political beliefs. I know in today's culture, that's something that people on both sides are very passionate about, because you obviously feel the way you feel for a reason, and that no matter what reason that is, you should feel strong in that. But I do think at the end of the day, we can all relate to the fact that we are humans, and finding common ground, even it sounds simple, sounds cliche, but I think it's vital, honestly.
You mentioned that it's vital and it sounds cliche, and I couldn't agree more. I mean, we're like the bridge people, and I agree that it sounds cliche. How do you think about how most people in our generation perceive the idea of finding common ground?
Ooh, that's a really good question. I think common ground, sometimes people associate that word with the word compromise too. So kind of like we were talking about, I think it scares people away, to be honest, when they hear the word common ground, because they think in order to find common ground, they have to compromise. Like Hayden addressed earlier, obviously, you do not have to shy away with your convictions and your beliefs. And so I think getting rid of that stigma and understanding that having these conversations allows us to find a way to find common ground without compromising.
That's interesting that compromise is, and I agree with you. I mean, I think that when people hear compromise, they assume that really what you're trying to do is find the midpoint between two extremes. And that is oftentimes the midpoint is not always the most optimal outcome. How have you gone about overcoming that critique on campus as you've sort of expanded your membership and recruited more students to join?
Honestly, I think the big thing with that is when we start out events, the first thing that we say is we're not here for you to necessarily compromise. If you find common ground, great. But if you walk away from this discussion and the only thing that you have gained out of it is this discussion, that is also a win. We had a debate between the Students for Life and Students for Reproductive Rights here on campus. I would be willing to bet that just about everybody in that room that entered left with the same opinions. I'll bet they didn't find a lot of compromise there. I'll bet none of them really changed their opinions on it. But they had that conversation. They had the conversation in a really peaceful way, and they had it in a way that had them, laughing by the end of it. They were cracking jokes. They're making friends with these people that are across the aisle on an issue like this. If we're really just sitting there and fostering that sort of community where you can come and have your own opinion without having to change your opinion, I think that does a lot of great work.
Yeah, it's almost like the best antidote to polarization is humanization, right? It's this sense of recognizing that people that, especially, in that Students for Life and Students for Choice debate, you have people that oftentimes perceives the other side as fundamentally evil, right? In some cases, and yet you find a certain sense to humanize that. Do you think that process of like humanization and this idea that we need to confront difference with a conversation instead of conflict, do you think that has like resonance and credibility, or do you think more work needs to be done to foster credibility around that concept?
I think there's definitely work that needs to be done. I was talking with the president of the Turning Point chapter here, and he described the term to me, coded liberalism.
Mm-hmm.
And that was something I had never really heard before. I asked him to elaborate on it. And his argument with that was more or less that a lot of these organizations that claim institutional neutrality end up in practice not being institutionally neutral. And that causes a lot of issues, that causes a lot of conflict. And I think at the source of that is kind of part of the reason why a lot of conservatives feel targeted in their beliefs. And I think combating also that kind of idea where an organization like Bridge is not actually just a coded liberal organization designed to brainwash you, where we are actually a neutral institution designed to have that conversation.
Ashlyn, what do you think about coded liberalism?
I think that's the perfect way to kind of put what stigma surrounds organizations like this, articulate it in a way that makes sense. I was talking to a friend of mine who's conservative, and I was kind of asking her what she thinks and thinks of Bridge and specific, things like that. And what came up again was the word compromise. I just think that you see these organizations, and it's really easy just to assume that they are left leaning, because I think we're in a culture today where maybe not necessarily, I would say conservatives aren't as eager to come out and be like, somebody talk to me and I will hear you and we'll have a conversation. I think we have an extreme of like, somebody come and debate me or change my mind or I'll change yours, but it's not necessarily a low-key surface level type of conversation that we're marketing. So it was really helpful to hear her input, because of course we believe the same things, but because of our affiliation with Bridge, she has a very different perspective on that. So I think it's very cool to kind of hear an outsider's perspective who's not on the exec team of Bridge and understand how we can move forward and market to conservatives while we aren't necessarily taking away from our appeal to liberals.
Do you get criticized by fellow conservative students for being a part of Bridge?
I wouldn't say I've ever been criticized. I think there's kind of this just unsaid thing, because I'm a part of it and I'm the only one on our exec team who really identifies as a conservative, that it's out of the ordinary already. I've never had a conversation with people who agree with me very similarly and asked why I'm a part of it, or necessarily looked down upon because I'm a part of it. But I do think they just find it kind of surprising.
Yeah, it's so interesting that, and in very conservative environments, liberal people oftentimes have a similar critique. They think that we're a bunch of coded conservatives. It seems like if you're the person that's trying to get someone from the other side to come along, it's like you definitely have an agenda, which I think speaks to, again, sort of this moment that we're in where I think our generation just operates with a lot of skepticism. It seems that that's the case, whether you're right or left. Would you guys agree that skepticism is sort of what pervades students across the board, sort of skepticism of institutions, of things, of the elite, regardless of politics?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Without
Yeah,
a
I would definitely agree with that.
Do you think that that's an opportunity to create more bridges between people of different viewpoints?
Yeah, I think that's kind of the perfect place for bridge work to start.
doubt.
Okay.
We have these groups that are kind of fundamentally distrustful of anyone who is the outsider. Um,
Hmm.
and so with that, a lot of groups are kind of self-isolating. They're going into these, as Ashley mentioned, kind of the echo chambers. And I think that's kind of the perfect place where we can bring those groups out and, make that connection between other groups and have them start facilitating, even partnerships between different organizations where Bridge isn't necessarily involved after.
So you mentioned, Ashlyn, that you're the only conservative on the executive board, and I know that's the case at other BridgeUSA chapters as well. Um, what do you think we can do to change that?
That's a really great question. I think that's something our exec team is discussing, especially as we're heading in to this semester and this academic school year. How can we kind of change the population of the people that come to our events? Because yes, it's 50-50, but sometimes it's not 50-50.
Absolutely.
So I think that's a really, really great question.
Like, let me, and I'll actually rephrase it while you're thinking about it. Is like, imagine your channel. Imagine I was sitting there and your conservative friends were talking to the CEO of BridgeUSA, and they got to ask all their darkest critiques and questions and like skepticisms. Just how would you channel that?
I think honestly, it kind of comes from this place where I don't think it's necessarily solely conservatives. I think it's
Hmm.
this idea that as a generation, we don't believe the idea that you can have a conversation with somebody without standing like down on your own beliefs. And I know I've said that before and I sound like a broken record, but I do think if you look back even into the 80s and the 90s, people got along a lot better. And I think it's just because there wasn't that stigma that politics had to be these walls that had to be built up and you had to stay behind your wall. Now I think if we can work towards having people understand simply by word of mouth, saying, hey, just come to our event. We don't want you to compromise. Like your goal is to not compromise on your beliefs. And if you leave not compromising, you're a golden. Of course, if you come to the event, you have conversations with people, you find it very beneficial, and you maybe start to change your mind about an issue or a topic or something like that. Of course, adjust as needed. But I do think there's just this stigma with our generation that one thing can't happen without the other, when truthfully both can coexist. And I'm not saying compromise is bad, but I'm just saying that we've maybe turned it into the enemy.
Yeah. Uh, you know, um, you said earlier that you invoked our good friend Charlie Kirk, and you invoked change your mind, and that almost in some ways is the brand of campus discourse, right? And so in some ways, what you're saying, and tell me if this is wrong, is that whether you're conservative or liberal, the fact is that most people would agree that we need to have productive conversations. We just don't think it's actually possible. Is that the right interpretation?
Absolutely.
Hayden, what do you think about that sort of diagnosis and whether that's accurate?
Yeah, I think honestly, a big problem that we have with kind of having this productive conversation starts well before the conversation stage and kind of into the stage of like the other side are full of idiots. And that's something that I hear on both sides of the aisle all the time. Like, oh my God, the other side, they cannot even possibly imagine or understand what we're talking about. And I think that as a kind of fundamental argument, that lack of understanding of where the other side is coming from is the largest blocker to our ability to have a productive conversation. My favorite example of that is fossil fuels. Fossil fuels are obviously a very divisive kind of topic across the aisle. And for conservatives, the main reason they don't vote against fossil fuels is because that's what our states run on. Tomorrow, if the fossil fuel industry were to disappear, so would Wyoming. That's what our entire economy relies on, and what the people of Wyoming rely on. But then if you look out to the other side, the liberal side of that argument, it's looking towards the future, towards climate change, that kind of thing. But there's very little crossover between the two sides in terms of where they're coming from on that issue.
So it's you're sort of adding a flavor to the challenge, which is it's not just that we don't think it's possible, it's that we see part of the reason why we don't think it's possible is that we see the other side as fundamentally wrong on a lot of these issues. So there's like a misunderstanding of the other side as well. So I'm curious, as you think about what it would mean to actually change the brand of campus discourse, like that's almost what I see this as, is like how do you rebrand campus politics, so that it is not one that is around necessarily change your mind and combat. It's much more around human curiosity and dignity and empathy and a deep understanding of where people stand. Do you think that what do you think is sort of the way in which we enable more students to get behind this work? Do you think it is a evolution of the message? Do you think that there needs to be a greater emphasis on better dialogues? Do you think that it's a in some ways, like I almost view it as like, what is like the angry message of Bridge? Like everyone has a rallying cry, right? And we don't actually have a negative message. But yeah, I'm curious how you think we get more young people, just not just conservatives or liberals, but just across the board on board with the mission.
Yeah, I think honestly, a humbling of our generation might be a really good thing. Um, I
What
have
do
a
you mean
lot of
by that?
students. Yeah, I have a lot of students that come to me when I invite them out to a bridge discussion, and they say, "Well, I don't know anything about politics. I can't really
Mhm.
add anything to this dialogue." But I think that is actually an incredibly beautiful stance. Them willing to admit that they're not necessarily that knowledgeable on a topic. And I think if a lot more people on both sides of the aisle had that stance, we'd be able to come in and have a much easier conversation. If you're willing to admit that maybe I don't understand the other side's point of view on this topic, then it's really easy for the other side to just be like, hey, this is why I believe the things that I do. And, at the end of the day, whether you come away from that agreeing with them or not, at the very least, you're going to understand that the other side maybe isn't actually full of idiots. And that they do have a valid reason for believing the things that they do. Even if, again, you fundamentally disagree with it after that conversation, at least now you understand where they're coming from instead of kind of throwing tomatoes at an invisible target where you don't even really understand what you're angry at or what you disagree with.
Tomatoes are too light. I think we need to throw like poison darts at our targets. Let's just eliminate the people we disagree with.
Right.
Ashlyn, what do you think?
I agree with Hayden completely. I think humility is the building block for respect. And I don't want to say our generation or our culture nowadays lacks respect, but I do
Mhm.
think that we could use more of it. So I think
Mhm.
being willing to do what Hayden was saying, humble ourselves to know that we don't know everything. Nobody chooses to be wrong. And following that with the idea that I can respect somebody without agreeing with them.
When you think about humbling yourself, there's a corollary feeling that I'm curious about, which is I also think part of the reason why our generation is skeptical is that we feel like we've been exploited. And I feel like a lot of people feel like they're being exploited by different interests, by different leaders. And I think what people on the extremes are really good at is weaponizing that sense of exploitation. In some ways, I also feel like our anger is also exploited by sort of like, and our outrage is also exploited by people. And in some ways, Bridge is actually a way for you to protect yourself against being exploited by the outrage mob. I'm curious what you all think about that message and if that message makes sense.
I think this kind of goes back to what I was saying before, but with humility, I personally used to think if I am humbling myself and being not prideful, that makes me vulnerable. And I think a lot of people have that same mindset, and nobody wants to choose to be in a vulnerable position, especially like you were saying, in the chance that you are exploited because of that vulnerability. So I think there's also a stigma attached to humility. It's that you're almost stronger when you are able to humble yourself, take a step back, see where your pride is, and then continue on versus being super aggressive and whatnot. I think that almost makes it so dangerous that we fear the exploiter so much that we start to become the exploiter. So I think, yeah, like kind of desensitizing that to be like, hey, if you say something that makes you sound like you're vulnerable, you're not actually vulnerable. You know what I mean? Or you're not vulnerable in a way that people will prey on you.
That vulnerability is actually a strength.
Yes, absolutely. I couldn't agree more.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And I think also to an extent, there's this kind of idea of there people are allying with like the lesser of the exploitative parties. For example, a lot of people that work in the fossil fuel industry recognize full well that the companies could pay them more, that they probably are getting, the short end of the stick on their like budget and everything, but that they're still getting a better deal than they would with the other side. And so, maybe they are being exploited, but they're being exploited to a lesser extent than they feel like the other group would exploit them.
Right, right. And it's almost like, one of the phrases that we use on the show is the outrage industrial complex. And I feel like our generation hates industrial complexes in general. And I think that like social media essentially the currency is outrage. And the fact is that by being angry, I feel like we're more likely to be exploited for people's profits, especially the influencers out there that understand that the way to sell a message and the way to sell a product or their brand is you say the crazy shit out there. And in some ways, Bridge is almost inoculating you against that. But it's a complicated, message to sell pretty quickly. But I think in some ways what you both are doing is fascinating. Here's my last set of questions is speaking of humility, whenever we speak with young people, and we did this with presidential candidates in the last Republican cycle as well, was like, what do you think is the biggest critique of your own side? What do you, and the way that I would actually frame it for you is like, what do you think your side is wrong on? And so, Hayden, you've described yourself as a center left individual. What do you think is wrong with your side?
Yeah, honestly, I think the biggest thing is that we've let the extremes get too extreme. It is kind of the job of the centrist to bridge the gap and to make sure that those extremes don't get too much power by preying on people's fears, by preying on their anger. And we kind of weren't effective enough to stop the extremes from gaining enough power. We fell victim to our own form of polarization early on, and it just became this nasty loop where people got more polarized and then they got more extreme and then they got more polarized, and I think that has just we failed to stop this kind of self-destructive loop.
Ashlyn, you describe yourself as as right-leaning, as a conservative potentially. What do you think is wrong with your side?
I think this might be the most common answer you hear if you ask a liberal or maybe even a conservative like me. I do think it's the way we allow ourselves to be portrayed and do nothing about it. I think that honestly, when I think of somebody who's conservative, oftentimes from a liberal perspective, if I were to put myself in someone's shoes like that, I would think, oh, they are racist and they, want all these things for America that's going to destroy all these minorities. And they think that we just need, how do I want to say this? I think we could do a better job of being softer with each other. I think the conservative ideal sometimes is that aggression is a strength and never a weakness. And I disagree fundamentally with that I think aggression is a strength in some cases, but I also think it is a weakness and that it doesn't always help an argument win 100% of the time. So kind of putting our guard down and letting people know us before they know our political beliefs, and not necessarily that has to be required, but kind of giving this image that we're not these people that are trying to destroy the United States. We just kind of sit there and we take it. And I honestly don't see anyone doing anything about it, even though it's wrong. And in some cases, of course, it is not necessarily wrong with some people. But yeah, I just do think that we need to be more proactive in different areas than we're being proactive in right now.
It almost sounds like if you want the other side to know you better, maybe you should show up to a bridge dialogue. Who figured?
Wow.
Profound.
Yeah.
Well, thank you both for taking the time. I learned a lot. I think my takeaway is that I think there's an opportunity to actually rebrand campus dialogue, and campus dialogue is in some ways, I think, emblematic of broader cultural dialogue. And I think it's really interesting that when you think about campus dialogue, what comes to mind is like change your mind, right? And what someone like Charlie Kirk does on a campus. And I think there's an opportunity actually to flip that. Last question I just have is, um, as you both have worked together over the last semester or so, being on different sides of the political spectrum, have you found that relationship to be fruitful? Have you learned things from each other, or do you just hate each other more?
I hate Hayden. I know, I'm just kidding. I could not hate Hayden. I think it really helps that we were able to get to know each other first before stepping into the bridge field entirely, or even the student government field entirely. I spent a week with him my freshman year. He had to drag me and my group around all over the place of campus. None of us wanted to be there, but I think in a way that kind of bonded us a little bit. So then we were able to have this relationship and be able to be friends and have constructive dialogue without coming away from the conversation feeling anger or hatred or wishing I never had to talk to Hayden again. I truthfully think it has opened, my relationship with him has opened doors to having relationships with people who maybe lean even further left and would be quote unquote like harder to love or harder to get along with. I think Hayden has been like a perfect stepping stone for me personally.
Hayden, this is your chance to throw Ashlyn under the bus.
Yeah, normally I would say I'm pretty good at identifying people's political beliefs, like pretty early on, in terms of talking to them. But Ashlyn totally mystified me. It came as a total surprise to me when she told me that she was actually like a relatively conservative person, and I think that as a whole was really good for my kind of perspective on conservatives. I had worked with her before. Obviously, we had done like the orientation, stuff like that. And so, like Ashlyn said, we had built up this really good relationship. And then she suddenly was revealed to be this conservative, the imposter in the group. And I think that was really good because now all of a sudden I'm like, okay, this is a person who apparently I fundamentally politically disagree with her, but we're great friends. We go out for coffee. I buy them breakfast every once in a while, that kind of thing. And I think that's been really good in terms of just rebranding the way I can view conservatives as close friends.
And it's interesting, a critic of this work would listen to this and they say, well, it's great that they're friends. And so what? I mean, the fact is, as you're talking, you've better understood each other's views. And I think being able to better understand each other's views and actually build those friendships across lines of difference, I think is like the building block to actually resolving the mess we're in. And in some ways, I actually think it's the more courageous thing to do. Like the easiest thing to do is to go, shout in your own echo chamber. And in fact, I think you're in some ways pioneering what the future looks like. And I actually think that's also something we as bridge building people need to lean into is we're not actually going back to the status quo. What we're doing is we're fundamentally charting what tomorrow looks like. And I think young people want to buy into something that's forward looking, not like let's sit around and have like a kumbaya conversation sometimes. And I think casting it in that way is really powerful. So thank you both for your time. I really appreciate it. And it was awesome to hear from you both.
Yes, thank you
for
so much
hosting
for
us.
Well, I really appreciated listening to Hayden and Ashlyn. I think that they demonstrate an opportunity for what actually tomorrow could look like. And whether it's rebranding campus politics or it's thinking about the ways in which students across the country think through our politics, I think that this is a lens that we need to forward more. And if you want more amazing people like Hayden, like Ashlyn, especially check out their work at Wyoming. The Bridge Wyoming chapter is doing great work, but broadly what they're doing in their own individual lives, think about ways in which we can elevate this politics. And I think, especially if you're still here with us, there's an opportunity to hear more of these conversations. So every Monday, YouTube, Spotify, Apple, sometimes you hear from me, sometimes you hear from amazing students, sometimes you hear from political leaders, sometimes you hear from just people that are trying to shape and change the way in which our politics engage. And so I'm so grateful for you being here, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye, everybody.